Hey, what is going on, guys? Carter here with Edge Mindset. Thanks for hanging out with me. Thanks for joining me for this video. This is going to be one of those, let's talk about some stuff, right? Let's get some things off my mind. I got some opinions on this particular topic. So yeah, thanks for hanging out. Like, comment, subscribe, all that stuff if you haven't done that already. So we're talking, I'm just going to try to see how many knives I can pile into this frame here. We're talking about the Holy Trinity. The Holy Trinity of American manufacturing or something. So a little history here. So I got a couple different things I want to run through. First of all, this video is inspired by a video I saw on Instagram from Transparent Knives. Those that don't follow him, check him out. Really smart kid, very talented. Now, I don't follow him on YouTube, I don't believe. I will try to see if I can find his account on YouTube. I assume he has one, and then I will try to link the video to the short on YouTube here. If not, I'll try to find it on Instagram and put that URL as well. If you want to watch his video first, that will give you some more context for what I'm going to run through, but it's not required. But it would help you kind of get a little more background on here. Now, before I dive into a couple of opinions, some of these opinions are going to be answering things he said in his video, and some of these are just my own things that I've been thinking of. But for those that are completely clueless right now, when we talk about the Holy Trinity, it is Rick Hinderer, it is Chris Reeve of CRK, right, Sebenza, and it's Strider knives, mixed Strider knives. So the Holy Trinity concept really was born like in the early-ish 2000s, 2000. I don't know who coined the term first, but that's when it was mostly being used, was like 2010, 2015, that whole area. Before kind of the whole overseas explosion of manufacturing, these three makers were kind of considered top of their game here in the U.S. and kind of defined modern knives, particularly tactical knives, right? So we're talking about what is popular in the echelon at that time. Obviously, there were slip joint makers, there was tons of custom knife makers, there was tons of like big production companies like Spyderco and things like that. But these three makers were kind of redefining, quote unquote, tactical high-end knives, and they all use titanium, right? Frame locks. That was the hot thing back then. Titanium frame locks had really exploded on the scene. Not necessarily invented then, but that's where they got really, really popular, to the point where a lot of people were like, if it's not a titanium frame lock, I don't want it in my pocket, right? So it kind of defined that era. Still very, very popular, obviously, today, but we're seeing more liner locks, nested liner locks, more interesting locks coming back again as well. So that is the original Trifecta. So over the years, there's been the concept of even when that was the nomenclature, people would kind of debate about it, but for the most part, everyone accepted this. Then as time went on, people start to ask the question, who is the new Trifecta, right? Is it Oz Machine Company? Is it Koenig? Is it, Brown Knives? Who's the new Trifecta for U.S. knife manufacturing? And there's been tons of debates. People have different opinions. Some people include one or multiple of these legacy ones. Some people say, no, this is old school. Now it's these new three ones. So Transparent Knives basically made a video speaking to this concept, and his opinion was that the Trifecta was never really a Trifecta. It was a Dufecta? Two. He only ever considered Hinderer and CRK as being in the Trifecta. He discounts Strider, and he gives specific reasons why. I'm going to counter those reasons just for funsies right now. But I'm also going to add in a new piece of criteria that I consider when talking about the Holy Trinity, right, the Trifecta of knife makers, and why I don't think any. Okay, we'll start with. I'm trying to think of the best way to attack this. Let me speak to his concerns first of all. So he had a number of criteria. I didn't write it down. This is coming from memory, but one of them was they needed to be legacy. They needed to be in business for like 10 years or more. And really that was his way of identifying the new trifecta. And that's why he didn't think some of these new makers that I mentioned, like Oz Machine Company and stuff, really count. In fact, yeah, these are all the reasons why he doesn't think those count, and why he still thinks Hinderer and CRK are the two that have ever existed and will ever exist. One is legacy, that they need to be around for like a decade or more. I don't know where he came to the 10-year. I don't know if 8 years count, or if he's going to change it to 11, but he picked like a decade as like the minimum to be considered part of a legacy brand or part of the trifecta. And on one hand, I kind of understand that, but on the other hand, like, these makers were coined as the trifecta well before they had been in business for 10 years. In fact, especially if you're looking at like, this is an XM24, but if you look at Hinderer's first model, the XM18, I was in the game when that dropped, when there was the insane fervor around that knife. You couldn't get it. Only like first responders could ever get their hands on it and things like that. He was a relatively new maker. Now, he had been making long before that custom knives and things, but the XM18 was his flagship production knife that like blew the doors off everybody. And that's what everybody was thinking of with his knives. And he was a new maker. And even CRK, I don't think was really around for 10 years at that point in time. And Strider technically kind of was, depending on, when you consider them as starting and when you consider the whole Holy Trinity concept as starting. But it was close. It was really close. And it certainly wasn't 10 years ago that they had came up with their flagship kind of folder design, right? Like, Strider started off doing fixed blades, and then their very first folding knife was the AR and GB liner lock. It would be a while until they came out with the first iteration of the SNG. And when the term of like the Holy Trinity was coined, they hadn't been around 10 years. Now, the number two criteria that he mentioned was that they need to have multiple successful models in order to be considered part of the Holy Trinity, which is also why he discounts like Oz Machine Company and Koenig, right? Because, essentially they've got a single kind of flagship model, whereas he was citing all the different models that that Hinderer and CRK have done. But once again, the same thing applies. When the term Holy Trinity was coined, Hinderer had the XM18. That was like his production flagship model. And then even CRK, it's like really just variances of the Sebenza and the Umnumzon. That's about all he had. The Nkosi hadn't been invented yet. Really, he had two main flagship folders, a couple fixed blades, things like that. But it wasn't all that impressive. And of course, Strider, which he discounts. And one of the reasons he kind of discounts Strider altogether is because of the lack of multiple models, right? Because he considers it kind of like I mentioned with Roosevelt, right? That essentially it's one knife model that's been scaled up a few times. However, where I'll refute the Strider thing is like, yes, this is the most well-known silhouette, whether it's the SMF, the XL, the SNG, the PT, or whatever in between. That is kind of the most recognizable silhouette that people think of with Strider. But they have done a ton of different models. Jibble, the J2, the Baby Huey, I always forget the name of the big Baby Huey that's like super crazy and in demand. They've got, of course, the AR and the GB that I mentioned before. Tons of fixed blade models. They've got RC, RCC. You can look up all of these models, and there's a bunch I haven't even mentioned. So they're actually, like, in terms of folder designs, Strider's pretty prolific. Now, they haven't done a bunch of runs of them, like kind of like this KRT right here. They did essentially one big run back in 2020, and they haven't, or at least as far as I know, and they haven't really done it again, right? They're not operating in a big production capacity. They have very limited production, and they're kind of sticking to the models that people like know of them. But they've got lots of different models, some of which have gotten very, very popular from like a cult status standpoint. So to discount Strider from this group because of their lack of models, I don't think makes sense. For me, you've got in my mind, the Holy Trinity is dead. It's a concept that existed at one point in time, and it just no longer applies to the current landscape. Like even if the current makers kind of hit on some of the things here, it was a snapshot in time, and I think it's a fool's errand to try to recreate it with the new Holy Trinity. Some of this was because this is all there was, right? Like, you got to keep that in mind too. This wasn't like these three makers were curated out of 100 U.S. knife makers. There was very few U.S. knife makers making production, like high quality production, tactical-oriented knives at that time. About the only maker who is excluded from this Trinity is Emerson. And I think he was only excluded because he didn't really do frame locks, and we were just so obsessed with frame locks at that time. And once again, I'm not saying that's, Benchmade, Spyderco, these were all out there, but these were like lower, especially at that time, these were lower end, high production knives, right? Plastic and shiny steel. Like, they hadn't gotten into titanium and things like that so much back in those days. I'm not saying it didn't exist at all, but it wasn't part of their normal offerings like it is today. The premium knife thing was just really taking off. And that's really what this means to me, is this is like a huge pinnacle of time in U.S. knife manufacturing, where we transitioned from knives being relatively inexpensive, throwaway kind of tools with, like I said, like bright plastic handles and shiny metals, to something more premium, something more, less produced, less billboarded, right? Another maker that could have been part of the Holy Trinity is Microtech. Now, I don't know why Microtech wasn't included in the Holy Trinity. That's a good question. They were doing a lot of really innovative things at that time, a lot of great models. They had been around a really long time. They did folders, they did titanium frame locks. So that's the only one that I'm not sure why that wasn't included. And I guess you could make the argument that maybe one of these should have been ousted and maybe Microtech put in. I don't know. Comment down below what your thought is on that. But this represented a cool snapshot in U.S. manufacturing, and there wasn't a lot of companies doing this. You'd get the occasional small company pop up, like Grayman Knives, who would do like their kind of version of this. They didn't really stick around. They have a little bit of a cult following with their 2 or 3 models that they did. I had a couple really cool guys. But, they faded away. These ones lasted. So that kind of speaks to the whole legacy thing. But like I said, when the Holy Trinity term was coined, these weren't legacy brands. These were relatively new brands for the most part, some longer than others. The other thing that I wanted to point out, though, the big criteria that I think Transparent Knives kind of missed on, and to me, the biggest thing that defines why these are cared about so much and why they're considered part of like the concept of a Holy Trinity is influence. Every single one of these knives had a very powerful influence on the market. At the time, CRK was manufacturing perfection. When CRK was operating, the level of machining precision that Chris was doing in his folders was better than anything else you could get, right? I mean, it was on par with some of the best hand-tuned custom makers that were out there, as well as lots of innovative features like the Umnumzon with the big detent ball and the lock face, the steels. He was part of creating the very first steel, S30V, that was the first steel specifically formulated for folding knives. Up until that point, knife steels were all repurposed from like tool steels and other applications. S30V was the first steel developed from the ground up for use in knives, particularly folding knives. And Chris Reeve was part of that. Same with S35, right? All of these big things. He was extremely influential in the pocket knife industry. He also bridged that gap between aggressive, tactical, hard use, strong folder, but still had a touch of elegance and class and refinement, right? He made knives that could be used in serious hard use applications, self-defense, things like that, as well as something you could throw in your pocket and carry to a nice dinner, right? Gentleman folders. Like, you can't deny how influential and important Chris Reeve was in modern knife making, as well as inventing the modern frame lock himself. Like, this is the Chris Reeve integral lock right here. He invented this, right? Then if you move on to Strider, extremely influential. Attitude, he really kind of, Strider knives turned the knife industry on their head. Up until this point, the concept of like a military folder was not something that was taken serious, right? The idea of a true armed services folder that kind of exemplified the look, the feel, the attitude, and the engineering behind it had not existed. Nobody had taken it serious, right? You had military folders that were like cheesy, right? You'd throw some camouflage paint on there. You would put some, Army Corps something or other insignia on there to try to make it look cool to appeal to kids and things like that. But Strider Knives was the first knife company that really kind of said, okay, if we were to take it seriously, like we were a military contractor and our goal was to develop the perfect folding and fixed blade knife offerings for actual use by the military, how would we do it? And not just from a surface standpoint, like everybody points to like the tiger striping and they're like, oh, cool, you put some tiger striping on there. Everything down to removing the most amount of parts possible, right? Look at the pocket clip. You have one screw because they use this tab that folds in and locks into a hole. This isn't the best example. It's a new version. Oh, here we go. Right there. Locks into that hole right there. No extra fancy materials. You've got a single piece backspacer and front scale, right? These aren't separate pieces. You've got just two pieces on here. You've got a screw, and then you got a female end that fits in here. There's no thumb studs, right? It's a hole with stop pins right there. Very simple design. Giant pivot. Like this is the first we see of oversized pivots. Everything on this knife was truly designed with the idea of what would somebody in the in the military, what would they actually want and use, as well as kind of the matte finishing, the lack of like paint, right? This tiger striping is done by doing a black oxide finish on the steel and then sandblasting these into it, right? As well as the minimal branding, right? Strider. And then it's got the little logo, and sometimes it says the steel. That's it. There's no big painted on or lasered like logos or anything. This looks like something that you would find at the bottom of like a surplus ammo can because it was issued to somebody for some tactical engagement, right? Now, you may not agree with this. This may not be your cup of tea, but this was revolutionary at the time, and it was very, very popular to kind of have something like that at the time. And we're still seeing influence from this echo into modern knife making, right? There's a lot of makers that are active right now that started by working on modifying, regrinding Strider knives. And you can see that in kind of their design language, right? They take a lot of inspiration from Strider knives. It's very, very influential. CRK, to me, or not CRK, Hinderer, to me, probably less overall influential. I always kind of saw it as somebody who took aspects from like CRK and then aspects from Strider and kind of met in the middle, right? Because these were pretty polarizing. A lot of people were very much either Strider or CRK. There wasn't a lot of room in between because there's a pretty big gap between these two knives and in the type of person it would appeal to and what the function was. And I always considered Hinderer to kind of fit in the middle there, right? A little bit better build quality, tighter tolerances, a little bit more refined, but also more aggressive and kind of harder use than you would typically see in a Sebenza, right? I mean, obviously you can look at these two, even though this is a modern interpretation of that knife. I always kind of saw it as kind of meeting in the middle, but there was, there was a certain something about those original Hinderers that just kind of spoke to people. They had the big, giant, chunky frame lock on here, similar to Strider, but just more machining, more refinement, more finishing, right? More complicated build, though. If you've ever taken apart a Hinderer XM18, you know how many pieces are involved and how it's kind of tricky to get the thing back together with pins and posts and stuff that want to fall out. The original version, of course, didn't have a lock bar insert, wasn't running on bearings, right? They were notoriously bad at flipping. And then, of course, he also did the flipper, right? Because one thing you'll notice between Strider and CRK, no flippers. These two companies have never done a flipper version of any of their knives. Hinderer kind of answered that request by offering something in between those two that had a flipper here. But they were all still hugely influential. Hinderer, of course, went on to be the most commercially successful, I would say, just in terms of volume of production, right? Hinderer became the biggest producer of these kind of knives, whereas CRK and Strider have remained relatively small in terms of the number of units they're producing. Strider did have a big kind of full production company for a while, but then they kind of dissolved, and now they've really turned into kind of more of a smaller operation, more intimate operation, far less output than they used to. So that's my criteria. So long story short, all blabbing aside, the trifecta to me remains the trifecta. It's these three makers, but I don't think it applies to today. We've got a whole different set of rules. We have a whole different set of competition. We have a whole different type of knife people are looking for right now with different features. And so trying to shoehorn a concept that was a snapshot in the 2000s and say, well, what is the new version of it? It's just nonsensical to me. There is no new version of it. We need to coin a whole different concept for the knife making environment that we're currently in. You've got to remember when this was a thing, Chinese knives were not even on the table. Like, Chinese made knives were legitimately just gas station cheap swap meet type stuff. It would be a few years later when we started to see some high-end stuff coming out of China. But even then, it was mostly copies and clones and things. We wouldn't see like new original manufacturing of a high-quality knife for some years after. And because of that, it's a whole different rule set now than when the Trinity was first kind of coined. So, all right, I'm done blabbing. Comment down below, what do you think of the concept of the Holy Trinity? The trifecta of U.S. knife manufacturing. I want to hear from you guys. Thanks for tuning in, and I'll talk to you later.